Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
A week or so ago, Lisa and I took our two boys that are still with us to a local trunk or treat put on by a local church. And as you went from station to station, you would get a little bit of a story from the Bible, somebody in costume, and then you'd get a little piece of candy or maybe a coloring book, something like that. Now, I have to confess that I had never heard of trunk or treat until a few years ago. I understand the concept. I like the concept, but it got me thinking about trick or treat and whatever happened to that. Now, when I say whatever happened to that, I don't mean whatever happened to giving out candy, because that's a very common thing and still goes on as it did when I was a boy. But there was a connection between tricks and treats when I was a boy that I would argue happily we seem to have lost. Now, I understand maybe this is before my time, and you can maybe get a hint of this in It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, that the knocking on the door, the asking for the treats, and this is how it connects to All Hallows Eve and the setting loose of forces of darkness. But the idea was, if you don't give us candy, we will do nasty things to you. Now, again, I've never seen that played out. I can't imagine anybody playing that. But what I do remember from when I was a boy is that the Halloween season included two behaviors that were kind of somewhere on the borderline between boys will be boys and juvenile delinquency. I remember growing up, being in Cook Township Elementary School there in Stallstown, Pennsylvania, and hearing my friends talking about these two behaviors. Oh, last night we went out soaping windows. Soaping windows. Have you heard of this? Where they would just go out with a bar of soap and sneak up on people's homes and their windows in the dark and smear soap all over their windows. And this was like great fun. I couldn't understand why in the world would anybody want to do that. But they talked about it like it was the greatest thing in the world. And then, you'd be driving back from school on the school bus. You could look out your window. You could see that the houses that had their windows soaped. But then, the thing that was actually mildly scary was this other thing that they called corning. Did you have this? Going corning. You would go corning. And what that meant is that you would go out with corn, shelled, that is no longer on the cob, and you would either toss handfuls of corn at people's homes and startle them, or worse, you would do the same thing to passing cars. And it was called corning. Never had the opportunity to do that either, though I certainly was in a home when the home itself was corned. I remember I was at my friend Randy Gooder's house. Randy was one of those heroes you never heard of, although he's a very blessed pastor of a church in Indianapolis. And I was over at his house. My parents were over at his house, and some of the local kids came out and started corning the house. And Mr. Gooder and my dad snuck out of the house and snuck into the car and got their deer spotlight and waited for the kids to come around the house and shone the light on them and scared them to death and got back at them. But, it's whatever happened to that? I'm not saying that I wish it would come back. I'm saying, when did it end? Or was this just a local thing in Western Pennsylvania? And if so, why? For all I know, maybe it's still going on there. It's been a long time since I've been there at Halloween time. But I remember driving down the road in the dark and hearing that sound as those kernels would hit the car. Later on, we may have a segment dealing with the question. I believe we do this week have a segment on is celebrating Halloween a sin? Well, you'll have to wait and see what I have to say about that. But this kind of celebration, as much as it might just be boys being boys, I want to suggest is not a good thing. Harming other people's property, even in a spirit of fun and playfulness, is not a good thing. Not something I would encourage or want my own children to be involved in. Not that, again, that I think anybody's tempted to do this. It just goes to show that things do change over time. Anyway, I hope that you don't corn and you don't soap and you don't get corned and you don't get soaped. And if it is okay to celebrate Halloween, and if you agree with that, I hope you'll have a great one. One of the many ways that the Westminster Divines handled their assignment of putting together the Shorter Catechism so well is that when they came to the Ten Commandments, they took the time, even in the shorter version, they took the time to highlight not only what a given command commands of us, but also what of necessity said command forbids of us. We looked last time in question 46 at the duties that come upon us through the first commandment. And now when we come to question 47, they turn the question inside out and ask, what is forbidden in the first commandment? I love that because it demonstrates an awareness of the scope of these commandments. Our propensity, because we're sinners, is to try to reduce them down to something as small and manageable as we possibly can. But by looking at both sides of the coin, our fathers push against that propensity. And they answered the question this way: what is forbidden in the first commandment? The first commandment forbids the denying or not worshiping and glorifying the true God as God and our God, and the giving of that worship and glory to any other, which is due to him alone. It forbids the denying of God or the not worshiping and glorifying of God. Now, you can start down that road forbidding the denying of God and think, okay, well, I've got this one down because I'm not an atheist. I know that God is real. I believe in him. I acknowledge his existence. But do we worship and glorify the true God as God? You know, when we look at Romans 1, one of the things that we see there is that in our fallen nature, we have this propensity to worship the creature rather than the creator. Because we bear God's image, because we were made for worship, we continue to worship. But because we are sinners, we would worship anything other than the true God, so we worship creatures. Well, we're called to worship the true God. We're called to worship him truly. In fact, when we look at that summary of the Ten Commandments that can be found in the Great Commandment, we know that we're called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Now, when I'm confronted with someone who is of a mind to deny the reality of ongoing sin in their life, someone who's embraced some sort of second blessing that involves complete sanctification, a finished work perspective, I like to follow something that I learned from my father. He would ask these folks, I just have one question for you. You say you don't sin anymore. My question for you is this: do you, at this moment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all your strength? That should end the conversation. In fact, when we come to this first commandment, we need to remember all the uses of the law. We need to realize not just, okay, is this something I'm going to be able to check off? Is there something I need to change so that I can check it off? I need to get past this. Well, we do have this obligation, and we should labor to increase in our capacity to keep it. But we also never should lose sight of the fact that right here in the first commandment, we come face to face with the horrible truth that we fail. That we're going to fail. That even we who have been regenerated and who are indwelt by the Spirit, we continue to fail. So what do? We continue to run to the cross. Our failure here is why he sent his Son. The goal, the end goal, is that we would worship and glorify the true God. I think that this is captured very well in one of the many wise and pithy slogans that have come to us from the pen of John Piper, who once said about the work of missions, missions exists because worship doesn't. Missions exist because worship doesn't. Now, it doesn't mean there's nowhere that worship is going on, but in places where it's not, we go and we send the missionaries so that the people would be converted, so that God would be worshipped. I hope we understand that one of the critical things communicated in that principle is this: that God didn't save us, and because of that, we ought to worship him. But rather, we ought to worship him. And because we didn't, he saved us. I know the name of the segment is Curating Your Book Library. But today, on the occasion of being as close as we are to the world's celebration of Halloween, I've stretched the point a little bit. And I want to encourage in this segment the reading of not a particular book, but a particular short story. Which short story is my favorite short story I've ever read, and which is quite chilling, even though it was written before there was a well-established genre of horror. The story of which I speak is written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In an earlier segment of curating your book library, I encourage the reading of a book by Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, which is one of my favorite novels ever, probably my favorite novel in the canon. And Young Goodman Brown now shows up as my favorite short story. And like The Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne gives us a peek inside his vision of what the world of the Puritans was like. It is an account of a young man, young Goodman Brown, who is on a journey, not a long journey, but nevertheless a journey, and night is beginning to fall, and he is dealing with the shadows and the sounds and some of his own fears, while he's thinking about the rumors that have been going around in the town that he's a part of. And those rumors are that certain people have been sneaking off into the woods to cavort with the devil himself. Well, Hawthorne does an amazing job, again, especially considering the paucity of horror fiction from before this time. He does an amazing job of building up the tension, and so that you sort of feel the woods sort of leaning down on young Goodman Brown, bearing weight against him. But this, well, how do I say this? I don't want to give any spoilers. But as frightening as it is, what we find out in the end, of course, is that the real horror is our own hearts. What we find out in the end is that every bit of hope that young Goodman Brown had in his neighbors was misplaced. And in fact, every bit of hope that he had in himself was misplaced. It is a story of sin. I've heard it said that Herman Melville wrote to Nathaniel Hawthorne, his friend, and he wrote about his book Moby Dick, and he described the book to his friend by saying, "My friend, I have written a wicked book." He'd written a wicked book. Well, one could argue that Nathaniel Hawthorne returned the favor in writing this wicked story. But I still commend it to you, not because I deny the power of God in our lives, but because I do agree with Hawthorne that so much of what we see is a facade. That we're not open, we're not honest. We hide our sins from each other, even as we seek to pretend that they don't exist. We hide our sins from God, rather than handing them to Him that He might hide them from us. Young Goodman Brown should be, for you, if you read it, a study in sin. Now, one of the reasons that I don't get my hopes up to hear from you when I ask for response, particularly from the Curating Your Book Library segment, is that I realize that you're probably not, those who are inclined to reply are not going to be reading a book every week. And if you are, you're not going to be taking my advice every week. I get that. And I'm certainly not reading all of these books a week at a time. Many of the books that I'm commending to you, most of the books that I'm commending to you, are books that I've read sometime in my past. But here's a simple one. Here's an easy one. Here's a short one. I don't know for sure, but I venture to guess, because it's written in English and because it is in the public domain, that it should be quite easy to find Young Goodman Brown for free on the internet. And as a short story, you could actually manage to read it on your computer. So I'm asking again, maybe when you go to bed on Halloween night, take up and read Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.